Hello, my name is Baxman, and the topic that I chose to explore is explicit instruction for vocabulary learning. The reason that I chose this topic is because it has been a primary focus for our kindergarten team this year. We have been reviewing our kindergarten curriculum and pulling out key words from our stories in Reading Street to teach to our children. This is important within our district because I work at a Title I district where many of our children come in with word poor backgrounds, which means they do not have a lot of exposure to new words and new vocabulary. Trying to get our children exposed and caught up to close that learning gap remains important and key. Why is vocabulary instruction so important? According to Stoll and Nagy, vocabulary is the most important single factor once children have learned the alphabetical code. It accounts for 50 to 60% of the variance in reading comprehension. Not only is vocabulary knowledge central to language comprehension, but it is also related to other language skills. Children with better vocabularies tend to have higher levels of phonemic awareness and learn to read more easily than those with restricted vocabularies. One important implication of this finding is that preschoolers with better overall language and vocabulary development will be at a better advantage acquiring phonemic awareness. These aspects of language tend to develop in tandem. The best instructional programs will address all layers of language organization. So the size of a student's vocabulary in his or her first language will also affect how well he or she learns vocabulary in a second language. Some children come to school with deficits in vocabulary. This creates a language gap that needs to be addressed. And as I mentioned before, that language gap is relevant within my district. This is known as the Matthew effect, where children coming in with that language gap are going to continue to have decreased learning because of the gap that they have already established before starting school. When considering the way students learn vocabulary, it is important to look at intentional versus incidental learning. Intentional vocabulary learning is when students are taught specific words to support the understanding of this text containing those words. Teachers also teach word learning strategies that students can use independently. When you are explicitly teaching students words to help support their knowledge and understanding of a text, you are teaching with intentional word learning. Incidental word learning is how most students acquire vocabulary. It is indirect exposure to words at home and school by listening and talking, by listening to books read out loud to them, and by reading on their own. This is very important to consider when we're thinking about students who come from a home environment where the adults are not using higher level vocabulary words. Those students are not as exposed to rich vocabulary at home, and this affects them with their learning at school. Both intentional and incidental vocabulary learning play an important role in the acquisition of vocabulary, but the role of incidental learning has been de-emphasized in such a way that it occurs only in the presence of intentional learning. Chu, Lin, and Pandian state this. What do students need to learn vocabulary? There are three main components of vocabulary instruction that are needed to boost vocabulary growth and improve reading. Students need to learn both the definition of a word and how that word is used in context. It's important not only to know what the word means, but what the word means in different situations. Students need multiple exposure to a word. They need to hear that word over and over again to retain it. Students need to be engaged and active while processing word meaning and use. It is not enough for a teacher just to tell students the definition of a word. The students themselves need to create their own definition, reuse, and regurgitate that word independently. Explicit instruction is a strategy that incorporates all these components. It is something that can also be used daily by classroom teachers to supplement any core reading instruction or any core reading program. Why explicit instruction? As stated before, vocabulary skills in early elementary school years are predictors of later reading achievement. In early elementary, alphabetic principle is critically important for students' reading ability. But when students come to that third grade level, that alphabetic principle becomes less important because their decoding skills have been mastered and vocabulary becomes more important for comprehension. If this is left unaddressed, the Matthew effect can increase that learning gap in children. Explicit teaching of vocabulary with the use of storybook reading has shown promising evidence that children, including those who come from low-income households, can close that learning gap with exposure. What is explicit instruction? Anita Archer says it best when she states that explicit instruction is systematic, relentless, engaging, and successful. Explicit instruction is not something that is done spontaneously. You do not make up the vocabulary lesson as you're reading the book or a book. The lesson is pre-planned, your words have been chosen ahead of time, and you have a lesson and definitions prepared to accompany that book. It is relentless. Explicit instruction is done daily in a classroom, or for our team it is done daily. We choose our words to review and to re-engage every day. It is engaging. Students are part of the process. It is not simply looking words up in a dictionary and writing down the definition. It is not simply having a teacher tell the students the meaning of a word. Students become engaged by giving you the meaning of the word as well, and by using that word in a sentence. It is successful. Students who are taught with explicit vocabulary instruction are able to regurgitate and reuse those words successfully. What does explicit instruction look like in a classroom? It's not having students copy a list of words, look up definitions, and then memorize those definitions. A teacher stands in front of the class and provides student-friendly definitions of word meanings. The teacher offers multiple exposures to target those words. The words are said repeatedly in a lesson, and the students do a choral response, repeating those words back to the teacher. It requires time. It is not short. It's not something that's inserted 5 minutes before a story. A good instruction takes about 20 minutes, and it requires students to be actively engaged, responding, thinking about words, using words, acting those words out, and retelling those words to the teacher. If you look to the left, there is a video of Anita Archer doing an explicit instruction vocabulary lesson, which is the perfect example of what it should look like in a classroom. When you teach a new word, there are certain steps you follow to teach it explicitly. You pronounce the word, and you have the students pronounce that word back to you. You find the syllables. You find its part of speech. You write the word and you read the word. You do not use dictionary definitions. You use student-friendly definitions and explanations. Depending on the grade level, you might use visuals as well. You check students' understanding of the word by asking yes or no questions about the word. So for the word soar, I would have my students repeat it. Say soar, soar, clap soar, soar. How many syllables? 1. And then I would explain, soar is a verb that means something is flying through the sky. When I would check understanding, I could ask, would it be easy for a rock to soar through the air? If a person throws it, yes. Would it be easy for a car to soar through the air? No, not unless it's a superhero's car. Do birds soar through the air? Yes, birds soar through the air. Do bees soar? Yes, bees soar through the air. And then I would give my students a chance to turn and talk to each other and think of examples where things can soar or things cannot soar. After a turn and talk, they would then have a chance to share out what they or their partners thought of when they were using the word soar. And a way to extend this through the day is to give students points for using the word appropriately in a sentence. How do you choose words to teach? According to Archer and Hughes, you can teach 3 to 10 vocabulary words in depth for a body of knowledge to be introduced. It is important to consider your students' age and your students' background knowledge when teaching terms. Select words that are important to the passage or unit or the text. For younger grade levels, much of the vocabulary taught will most likely be tied to a text. For older grade levels, vocabulary is necessary to learn the content that is being taught by the teachers and is not necessarily tied to a specific text, but is tied to a body of knowledge. So if you're studying the water cycle, as my daughter was doing today, the vocabulary was not tied to a story, but it was tied to the steps of the water cycle itself. You want to select words that the students will hear, read, and write in the future. Do not choose words that the students will not come across very much. because they need multiple exposures to those words to learn them and remember them. So if you're teaching students words that you're only going to come across once or twice, it is not something that the students will retain. And do not select words that are easy for the students, that they already know and are embedded in their background knowledge. Select words that are difficult to learn, that students may need help with, and students may need interpretation or definitions for. Word learning strategies are necessary strategies for explicit instruction. It involves the use of word parts, context clues, and dictionaries to determine the meaning of unknown words. When doing this, you need to explain what is meant by word parts and how to use them. Discuss those word parts or morphology of a word. Explicit teaching of word parts is important. One method of promoting knowledge of word parts is to implement instruction that is, in addition to using a word list, targets new words derived from common roots. This is pointed out by Paddock, Newton, and Rosinski. Word study sessions usually last 10 or 20 minutes and can occur 2 or 3 times a week. During a word study session, as a teacher, it is your job to provide in-depth instruction on prefixes, suffixes, and roots. Once students have a clear understanding of those word parts, the word study sessions can be discontinued or limited so that the students that need additional focused instruction. When teaching the morphology of a word, remember to let your students know what are the base words, the root words, and the affixes. Aside from explicitly teaching the word in Anita Archer style of I do, we do, you do for the initial exposure, there are other vocabulary activities you can use to teach words. A key way to teach and give multiple exposures to students is by using connected text. Using text that contain a coherent message, such as a social studies book and a newspaper article containing the same keywords, gives your class multiple exposures. The vocabulary activities listed are ways to use connected text in explicit teaching. The first example is a glossary bookmark. A glossary bookmark provides students with reference containing the key vocabulary words. So you want to create bookmarks for text that will be used over time in a unit. And then the students can transfer those bookmarks from reading to reading across multiple texts. You can also use vocabulary checks. Determine students' understanding of vocabulary before, during, and after explicit instruction about the vocabulary. This is a good way to assess students. Students can rate their understanding of a word prior to instruction and prior to reading the text by having the word listed and checking to see if they know the definition. If it's a word they have not been exposed to before, then their own self-monitoring or self-checking lets them know that this is a word they need to learn and a word they need to remember when they come across it again. Students can create a vocabulary record. It provides a nice scaffold for students to demonstrate their understanding during each step of explicit instruction. As a teacher, you provide the initial vocabulary instruction And after each step, providing the student-friendly definitions, using the word in context, multiple exposures, and opportunities for engagement. The teacher provides time for the students to process the information. The students themselves write their own personal definition or sketch their own personal definition of the word, and then they write their own sentence using that word. The teacher can then go and play games such as I Spy, using the words that have been taught. For example, I spy a word that means hard work, such as labor, or I'm thinking of a word that means bending to the ground, such as crouch. You can also create a word wall of prefixes. This is the example of using morphology to teach vocabulary. Instead of having a traditional word wall with complete words, we use complete words in the younger grade, have a word wall of word parts. Your students can access that word wall and use it for clues when coming across new words in their reading. And finally, it's very important to connect that new vocabulary to writing. Give students opportunities to apply what they have learned by writing about it. Remember, when you're explicitly teaching words, the words you are teaching have been carefully selected and will help students learn and understand the content that you are teaching. When you teach the words, you have the students pronounce the words, find the syllables, and find the word parts. Provide a student-friendly definition of the word. Use that word in context or give it contextual information. Give the students plenty exposures to that word. Say it again and again throughout the lesson and give students the opportunity to repeat that word back to you. And offer students the opportunities or involvement in defining, regurgitating, and reacting to that word. Instruction and word learning strategies provide students with the strategies and skills that enable them to figure out the meaning of unfamiliar words and increase their word knowledge. It is important for students to build up that vocabulary and word knowledge and build up their vocabulary knowledge so they are not prone to the Matthew effect. Word learning strategies that provide students with the skills to figure out the meaning of unfamiliar words are learning and knowing how to identify and use contextual clues, knowing how to use word part information, and it's important to know how to use the dictionary for students to independently find the meanings and definitions of words. It's important to use the key components for teaching word parts. Provide students with the prefixes, suffixes, and root-based word knowledge. Teach meaningful word parts explicitly and not just independent vocabulary words as well. And use different teaching strategies as an approach. When students use their new vocabulary in writing, they connect their knowledge that they're learning and to their own independent thoughts, and they gain a deeper understanding of targeted words.